A peaceful evening in Chicago. A lingering melody and an unanticipated display of bravery that occurs when one instant calls into question all of our beliefs regarding justice and humanity. Watch to the very end to learn the powerful truth, and remember to like, share, and subscribe to help fund more stories like this one. Chicago's night was silent, interrupted only by the distant hum of automobiles and the sporadic chatter of late-night walkers. The silenced Chuck Norris, wearing only trousers and a black jacket, went steadily towards his car. It was one of the few times he had some alone time, a peaceful respite from the bustle of Hollywood and the stares of photographers. As he turned a corner, he heard a gentle, melancholy tune on the wind. It was the sound of a guitar, its notes raw and intensely emotional, filled with a kind of pain that made Chuck stop in his tracks. He tilted his head, listening more intently, and followed the sound until he saw its source under a dim streetlight. The cool evening air was a welcome contrast to the bright, suffocating lights of his everyday world. A cardboard sign with bold, uneven letters for food was placed next to a black man who was hunched over an old, battered guitar. The man's clothes were frayed, his shoes were so worn that they were falling apart, and his fingers moved across the strings with a grace and precision that seemed to contradict the instrument's worn state. "Thank you for your assistance." A battered head lay on the ground in front of him, holding a few crumpled notes and a few broken coins. Chuck paused a short distance away, mesmerized by the scene. The man wasn't just playing music. He was pouring his heart into it. The melody seemed to tell a story of loss and quiet desperation, but also of perseverance. A few people passed by, gave him a fleeting glance before rushing on their way, avoiding eye contact, as though the sight of him was a reminder of something they didn't want to confront. Chuck remained enthralled by the raw emotion in the man's playing, noticing the man's hands shaking slightly as he moved from one chord to the next, but the music never faltered. Suddenly, the silence of the moment was broken, and a harsh, commanding voice sounded, piercing the air like a knife. A big and broad-shouldered police officer approached the man with heavy steps and said, "I told you to get out of here." A second cop followed his face, which was more indifferent but no less. The man flinched as the first cop stopped in front of him and instantly moved his hands to shield his instrument as he kicked the hat on the ground without hesitation, scattering coins and dollars across the street with a harsh clatter. "I warned you not to return here." And the officer's voice kept becoming louder. "You believe that this is a free area for people like you, sir?" "I'm not bothering anyone. I'm just trying to," the man stammered, his voice shaking as he looked up at the officer. "Yeah, I heard it all before," the officer said sneeringly, grabbing the man by the collar of his jacket and dragging him to his feet. "Every one of you has the same SB story. This isn't your corner, and you're not welcome here." With a low, menacing voice, he pushed the man roughly against the wall. "How do you people always find your way into neighborhoods like this? You think you belong here, but you don't," he said. His voice was barely audible as he said, "If you want, sir, just let me go." His hands were raised in surrender, but the officer wasn't done. He said, "Step back slightly and don't even think about coming back, because if you do, we'll make sure you regret it." As the man staggered forward, the second officer moved up and quickly kicked the guitar lying there. The instrument made a loud cracking sound as it skittered across the sidewalk at his feet and struck the curb. The man let out a sharp cry and fell to his knees, frantically gathering the broken pieces of the guitar as the wood splintered and the strings snapped. His hands trembled as he held the damaged instrument, his face filled with anguish, and he whispered, No, tears welling up in my eyes. This was my father's guitar, which he had given me when I was a boy, and it was all I had left." As he glanced down at the man, the first officer crossed his arms and grinned. "Oh, another great musician, huh? What a joke," he said, gesturing to his partner, who started to remove a pair of handcuffs. "I attempted to take the simple route, But you guys never learn, so let's go. You can perform in a holding cell." The man didn't fight when the second officer took his arm and started to cuff him. But before the cuffs could be put in place, a steady voice said, "Hey." The officers froze and turned to face the sound. Chuck stepped forward from the shadows, his hands and pockets fixed. His tone was measured, but there was an unmistakable author in it. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes moving between the officers and the man on the ground. "This isn't your business." The first officer snapped his annoyance clear, kept walking. Chuck didn't move. Instead, he took another step closer. His calm gaze was fixed on the first officer. The second officer interrupted, his tone sharp. "Panhandling is prohibited in this area. He's disturbing the peace." The man's guitar playing. "Music isn't interfering with the song," he remarked gently. "It's survival." The first cop squared his shoulders and moved closer to Chuck, saying, "I don't know who you think you are, but you're interfering with police work. Last warning. Walk away or you'll be next." A small group of people had started to assemble, drawn by the commotion, and some of them were taking out their phones to record. Chuck looked at the onlookers for a moment before turning back to the officers. "You broke his guitar," he said, evenly. "Now you're arresting him for trying to survive. That's not enforcing the law, that's cruel." I responded, "Walk away," as the first officer's expression deteriorated and his annoyance increased. Chuck didn't flinch. Instead, his tone was forceful but calm. He said, "If you're going to arrest him for nothing, then arrest me too." The audience gasped, and the whispers became louder. After a moment of hesitation, the second officer moved forward, and the first, who was obviously agitated, stated, "Fine," removing another pair of handcuffs. As the officer went for Chuck's hands, he pushed aside the hair from his face, showing who he was. The masses' shouts that were whispers turned into Chuck Norris's. The officers briefly halted as someone yelled, realizing that dawning was upon them, but it was too late. Phones were lifted. High filming every second, the crowd exploded in indignation as the first police cuffed Chuck. But Chuck's composed look remained unwavering. "Their voices are getting louder. This is Chuck Norris. What are you doing?" someone shouted. Another shouted, "You're done. This is going viral." The officers appeared visibly uneasy and quickly led Chuck and the man towards their patrol car as the crowd followed, chanting and shouting. Inside the car, Chuck sat silently, his face unreadable, and the man next to him held the broken guitar to his chest. Outside, the crowd's voices subsided as the car drove away, but the weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air. The holding cell was dimly lit, and the walls were an unwelcoming shade of gray. Chuck Norris sat quietly on the metal bench, his eyes concentrated next to him, despite his comfortable position. For a while, neither of them spoke. Only the distant murmur of voices from the police station and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead broke the stillness. Samuel, the black guitarist, sat hunched over his broken guitar and clutched it tightly to his chest. The wood was splintered and the strings hung limply, but Samuel held it as though it were the most valuable thing in the world. Chuck broke the silence by asking, "What's your name?" in a soft but forceful voice while staring at the man. The man, Samuel, answered silently without raising his head to see Samuel Davis. Chuck gave a small nod. He said, "I'm Chuck," as if introductions were still required. "How are you doing?" Samuel shook and gave a hollow laugh. "I've probably gone through worse, but this feels like the end." "I don't know," he said. Chuck turned to look at him more intently. He firmly stated, "Everest, it's not the end." "I know it feels that way now, but it's not." Samuel letting out a sigh, his fingers grazing the splintered edges of his guitar. "You don't know what it's like," he said, his voice tinged with frustration and exhaustion. "Living like this, fighting just to get through the day, watching people look at you like you're nothing." He trailed off, his eyes falling to the guitar in his hands. This was all I had left to my father, who gave it to me when I was 10 years old. He claimed that music could get me through anything, and for a while it did. But now, before starting, Chuck paused to give Samuel time to collect his thoughts. "What happened?" he inquired gently. Samuel paused before taking a big breath, as if letting go of a burden he had been carrying for years. "I used to be in a band. When we first started, we weren't well known or anything, but we got enough gigs to cover our expenses. I had a wife, a daughter, a small apartment. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. But then everything fell apart. My wife had cancer, and we tried everything to save her, selling everything, but it wasn't enough." He stopped talking, and she didn't make it, and I lost my daughter to foster care, lost the band, and ended up on the streets. Chuck paid close attention to his demeanor, which was one of quiet pity. Samuel gazed at him with tears in his eyes. This guitar was all I had left, and it reminded me of who and what I was before. He pointed to the broken instrument, his voice trembling. "Now it's gone too." Chuck leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and he said, "I know it means more than that, but it can be fixed, and your story, your talent, no one can take that from you." Samuel shook his head, saying, "What difference does it make? People care more than you think. They just need to see you, really see you, and I'll make sure they do." Samuel gave him a skeptical yet hopeful glance. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his face wary. "You don't even know me." The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway before Samuel could reply. Chuck smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held warmth and determination. "Because I've been where you are." He admitted it was not the same way, but I felt that weight. I've been at a point where it seemed like nothing would ever get better, but someone once told me that if you can help, you should, so that's what I'm doing. Miller, sergeant, a senior officer, arrived at the door, his face displaying a mix of uneasiness and coerced authority. He opened the cell and entered, saying sternly, "You're free to leave, Mr. Norris." Chuck stood, but did not approach the door. "What about him?" he asked, nodding towards Samuel Sergeant Miller, who hesitated, saying, "You arrested him for trying to survive, and now you're letting me go because you realized who I am, but he's the one who deserves to walk out of here." Chuck interrupted him by playing music disturbing the peace. Sergeant Miller said, "I'm just following orders," and then he told whoever had given the orders that I wouldn't be leaving without him. "That wasn't my decision," he continued, shifting uneasily. According to Chuck, Sergeant Miller crossed his arms and looked at him in obvious frustration before muttering, "You can both go," and motioning for Samuel to stand, the younger man reluctantly rose to his feet while still holding onto the broken guitar as they passed through the station. The tension in the air was evident outside, and the reporters, activists, and worried citizens who had gathered after the arrest video went viral could be heard over the noise of the crowd. As soon as Chuck and Samuel entered the station, the cameras flashed, and the reporters began asking questions. Chuck put up a hand to calm the rattling. He remarked, "What happened tonight isn't just about me," his voice echoing across the audience. "It all comes down to how we treat one another. Samuel deserves that just as much as anybody else, and I won't stop until people like him are seen and heard." The audience cheered and applauded the energy. For the first time in a long time, Chuck and Samuel went down the stairs together while the cameras shot every moment. The weight on Samuel's shoulders felt slightly less when he stood a little taller. The days after the incident were extremely hectic for Samuel Davis because the video of him and Chuck Norris being arrested went viral, creating headlines and sparking discussions on social media. People from all around the world expressed their indignation, calling for the first time in years for justice for Samuel and accountability for the involved officers. Chuck had maintained his promise to make sure Samuel's tale was heard, and although the attention was overwhelming, it also opened opportunities Samuel never thought were possible. Samuel felt like he was no longer invisible. Chuck didn't waste any time helping. He first contacted a famous guitar craftsman to fix Samuel's broken instrument because he understood how much the guitar meant to him, not just as a material item, but also as a reminder of his connection to his past. While the repairs were being made, Chuck made arrangements for Samuel to stay in temporary housing offered by a nearby non-profit that assisted the homeless. It was a modest place, but it was clean, warm, and safe, a far cry from the streets where Samuel had lived for so long. Chuck paid Samuel a visit at the shelter that evening, bearing a folder full of paperwork and a faint grin of hope. Chuck laid out the contents of the folder on the table between them as they sat in the common area, with Samuel, who was still getting used to his new surroundings, greeting him with a genuinely apprehensive smile. "My thoughts have been that," Chuck spoke calmly but deliberately at first. "You mentioned that music was your means of self-expression, and that's what kept you going." "Indeed." Samuel stated that it's the only thing I've ever been excellent at. He nodded hesitantly, uncertain of the direction of the talk. Chuck bent forward, his gaze focused. "And then, let's return you to it. In order to raise money for housing efforts for the homeless, he slid a fly over the table for a charity event that was set to happen in a week. Speaking with the organizers, Chuck added that they would love to have you perform. This might be an opportunity for you to reach others who need to hear your music and your narrative." Samuel looked at the flyer with his hands on the table and said, "I don't know," after a lengthy silence. "I haven't performed in front of an audience in years. What if I make a mistake? What if they don't care?" Chuck's face smoothed out and he put a comforting hand on Samuel's shoulder, saying, "They'll care, because your music comes from a place that people can feel, and if you mess up, that's okay. You're not doing this to be perfect, you're doing it to remind people that no matter what life throws at you, there's always something worth fighting for." Samuel paused, then nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "All right," he murmured softly. "I'll do it." The week before the event was filled with hectic details. Chuck made sure that Samuel had everything he needed, including performance attire, and time in a small studio to practice. The repaired guitar arrived 2 days prior to the event, and when Samuel opened the case, he was astounded to see that it was nearly brand new, despite a few minor scars that the craftsman had left in place, claiming that they were part of its history. As Samuel ran his fingers over the polished wood and new strings, he experienced a wave of emotions that he was unable to add. The venue was a hive of activity on the night of the event, with philanthropists, activists, artists, and random people passing by. The tale of Samuel Chuck had ensured that Samuel was the center of attention, but he stayed silently helpful in the background, prepared to take over if necessary. Samuel stood backstage, his hands quivering a little. His nerves were evident as he adjusted the guitar strap over his shoulder, but so was his resolve. Chuck appeared beside him, calm and grounding him. He asked Samuel, took a deep breath, nodded and said, "As ready as I'll ever be." The audience watched intently as he positioned the guitar and adjusted the microphone, closing his eyes for a moment to allow the gravity of the moment to wash over him. Then, with a deep breath, he began to play. The first few notes were soft and tentative, but as he continued, his confidence grew, and the melody he played was a raw and emotional reflection of his journey, his struggles, his losses, and the glimmering hope that had kept him going. The room seemed to hold its breath as his music filled. By the time he was done, the audience was utterly enthralled. There was a brief period of silence before the room erupted in applause. Some stood, while others wiped away their tears. Backstage, Samuel was greeted by a barrage of congratulations as people came up to him and thanked him for sharing his story and his music. One of them, a music producer, gave him a business card that read, "You have something special. If you're interested, let's talk." Chuck discovered Samuel in the middle of the throng, his face gleaming with pride. "I told you that you still have it," he exclaimed. Samuel made a strange but welcoming sound when he chuckled. I suppose all I needed was someone to have faith in me for the coming weeks. With donations coming into the organization that had sponsored him, Samuel's life continued to change. The money raised at the event enabled him to find stable lodgings and began teaching guitar to children at a nearby community center. His tale continued to inspire others. One evening, while they sat on a park bench, Chuck continued to be there, checking in on him frequently and commemorating each milestone. "Why did you do all this? You didn't have to get involved that night," Samuel said, turning to Chuck. Chuck paused before answering, saying, "I could, and because someone like you shouldn't be forgotten." Samuel nodded, his eyes drifting to the skyline as the sun said, "Thank you for everything." The story of Chuck Norris and Samuel Davis became a symbol of hope and resiliency, a reminder that even small acts of kindness can lead to something much greater. It wasn't just about a man with a guitar, it was about the power of compassion and the courage to stand up for what's right. For Samuel, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one full of music, purpose, and the conviction that second chances are worth fighting for, because one act of courage can change everything. If this video inspired you, please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring tales that make a difference.